Chapter 5. The clicking of Webb's talons on the floor was the only noise that could be heard as he paced the classroom, occasionally making his way over to his students in order to politely observe their work on the quiz he had handed out, and be present if anyone needed some pointers. While the sound of Webb's approaching may have been a relief for some students in the class, for Peacemaker, he could not say that he was feeling encouraged as the teacher made his way over to the Nightwing-Rainwing hybrid's general direction. Beside him, Hyena and Cliff were diligently working on their scrolls, answering the questions Webbs had prepared for everyone on the board in front of the history cave. Meanwhile, Peacemaker had only answered 2 of the required 10 questions that their teacher had provided. For half the class, he had been trying to answer the questions that were provided to him, but every time he tried to formulate an answer, he second-guessed himself. Peacemaker blamed himself for this, as he had spent little time studying for this test, and the time he did spend studying was filled with confusion and headaches. It did not help that Peacemaker had not gotten much sleep the week before the test. His sleep was either too short or filled with the occasional nightmare. Right now, Peacemaker felt subtle fatigue from the lack of sleep he had received. Now, here he was, in the middle of a unit test, and he was behind. And Peacemaker felt if Webb saw him struggling on this test, a test that could potentially damage his grade beyond repair if he failed, then the seeming instructor may want to see him after class. So many worst-case scenarios ran through Peacemaker's head of what Webbs would suggest he do in order to keep up, or just fail Peacemaker, and, potentially, cause him to fall behind the rest of the court's winglet. As Webbs drew closer to him, Hyena, and Cliff, the bottoms of Peacemaker's feet began to sweat, and his talons shook as he dipped it into an inkwell again, trying to make it look like he was working. 3 moons, let something happen so he doesn't see my work, Peacemaker pleaded mentally. Question 8 is wrong, Hyena suddenly blurted out beside him. Everyone, including Peacemaker, and, thankfully, Webbs, looked up from what they were doing and stared at the Sandwing Dragon, who had suddenly stood up from her seat and walked to the center of the history cave and to the board where the 10 questions were written. As Hyena did this, Peacemaker could see from his peripheral vision Alligator place his talons over his eyes and shake his head as his friend stepped up front. Webb's reaction, for his part, was calm at Hyena's sudden comments. But underneath this calm was frustration as Hyena interrupted his class. Again. Hyena, Webbs muttered under a frustrated breath as he walked past Cliff and Peacemaker, much to his relief. I told you, come to me after class when you want to suggest material for next year's class. I'm sure it can wait. Nope, no it can't, Hyena replied, grabbing a piece of chalk as she wiped the question off the board with her other hand. The offending question that had Hyena bothered asked, The temples of the Mud Kingdom were built over 2,000 years ago during the reign of Queen Glade. What purpose did these underground temples serve, and how has it impacted the theories of modern historians? Hey! Shouted a Sea-Wing, Mako from the Copper Winglet. I was just starting that question! Hyena rolled her eyes. Well, lucky for you, I'm here to correct it, she said, shrugging off the comment and everyone who either had just started the question or had finished it. Webbs, for his part, was doing well on keeping his frustration in check, but for how long seemed to depend on what Hyena had to say. Hyena, the rest of the class need to know real history, Hyena interrupted Webbs, who growled softly. I promise you, Webbs, I know what I am doing. Webbs and Hyena stared at one another, unrelentingly. But it was Webbs who yielded first, knowing, like the rest of the class, Alligator in particular, Peacemaker assumed, that Hyena was not going to back down, especially since history was her favorite subject. Fine, Webb said, reluctantly as he approached the front of the cave. You can make your corrections, he said, but held up a talon just as Hyena was about to start. But if they are not relevant or are too minor, you are getting a 0 for that question. Hyena shrugged, unconcerned at Webb's comment as she proceeded to write on the chalkboard. Well, to start, you have the dates wrong, Hyena began, writing on the chalkboard 3,269 AS and 2,045 AS. While it's true that Queen Glade had ordered constructed temples during 3,269 AS, the underground temples that you mentioned were actually constructed by Glade's ancestor, Queen Amber, daughter of Queen Crane. Okay. Webbs nodded in agreement, clearly acknowledging the mistake he had made in the writing of the question. Thank you, Hyena. Now please have your... Furthermore, Hyena interrupted, turning back to the board, beginning to draw from one question that connected to a spot where she began to draw something. You should really tell us which period you're referring to when talking about mudwing strategies during the Great Cold War of 4008 AS. A nudge from one of Cliff's wings snapped Peacemaker's attention from the board to his friend, who looked at his own parchment and then to Peacemaker's own. Wait, Cliff wanted him to cheat? Just do it, Cliff whispered while looking back up at the board, making it look like he was focused like the class. Debate this later. Peacemaker hesitated a second, glancing back at Webbs, who was silently fuming at the corrections and errors Hyena was making. But, regardless, took the critiques professionally, though he had a feeling the Seawing would be having a few words with Hyena after class. But, ultimately, Peacemaker relented and proceeded to jot down some of Cliff's answers, but making sure not to copy them word for word, adding words of his own so that Webbs wouldn't be suspicious. Even though Peacemaker was relieved that he would have the answers down, he still felt guilty about copying, but would not stop himself from doing it if it meant salvaging his grade and avoiding critiques from Webbs. As he reached the minimum required questions to answer, 8 in total, Peacemaker started to calm himself as he finished up his answers about a mudwing philosopher from the early 1000s. Eventually, his attention was drawn back to the board, which now had a drawing of a mudwing underground temple, with a sketch of the interior. The sketch, in particular, looked like an upside-down triangle, and the corridor drawings almost seemed like a maze. This temple, in particular, was in honor of Queen Crane's boldness against the other tribes, Hyena explained, pointing to the structures themselves. What the exact purpose of this temple was? Hyena smirked at the class. Well, I can't answer for that for you, since that would be a spoiler alert for question 8. Webbs looked at the drawing, visibly impressed, though he still seemed a bit annoyed at how long it took for her to make her corrections. Impressive, Webbs admitted, his talons rubbing his chin. Thank you, Hyena, for your wonderful insight. Now, please, have your seat. Hyena smiled, proudly, not concerned with the dry remarks he had made, and proceeded to walk to her seat again, winking at Peacemaker and Cliff subtly as she sat down. That's when it dawned on Peacemaker. Hyena had staged the entire correction and the drawing so Cliff could help him? Did she risk Webbs' frustration to help him? Peacemaker felt both honored at Hyena's willingness to help him and nervous because he did not want Hyena to get in trouble for him. We have a few minutes left of class, Webbs announced to the class. Be sure to finish your tests, and when you're done, hand them in. Excuse me, sir, came the curious voice of Shadehunter. When Webbs nodded at her to ask her question, she looked at Hyena and said, How do you know the interior of those temples looks like? in so much detail as well. Hyena stood up, gave a confident smile, and answered, Simply put, because I've been in them. Everyone, except Alligator, looked at Hyena with surprise. After all, my parents are archaeologists, she explained proudly. So I've spent most of my life traveling to archaeological sites, and maybe triggering traps in said sites. Her gaze fell on Alligator, who had his head down on his parchment, trying to ignore the stares he got from the class. Always nice to have someone to pull me out of a few, huh, Alligator? Peacemaker could see Alligator's scales over his cheeks turn a shade of red as he blushed from her comment. Okay, Hyena, you've made your point, Webb said, irritably, gesturing her over to her seat. This time, she listened fully and sat beside Peacemaker. The class returned to answering the last few questions in the test. When the final gong of the day rang, signaling the end of class, everyone walked up to Webb's desk in order to turn in their work. To his Peacemaker's luck, he was one of them. He could have sworn that Webbs looked pleased at first glance of Peacemaker's work. Walking out of the cave with Cliff, Peacemaker actively looked around the crowd of students, who had all just left the history cave and were going about their evening routines, for Hyena. Luckily, he did not need to look for too long when he saw Hyena and Alligator standing together, talking. He was about to step forward, but stopped when he noticed Hyena press her snout against Alligator's forehead while adjusting his glasses. Standing back, Peacemaker pretended he wasn't paying attention to his two classmates and waited, at the same time stifling a yawn that wanted to leave his mouth. After the two shared a few final words with one another, Alligator gave a smile to Hyena before walking off in the direction of the pre-center. When the Mudwing was out of sight, Peacemaker approached the Sandwing, who turned to meet him. So, how do you think you did? Hyena asked him, gesturing him to follow her in the opposite direction Alligator was going. I think I did okay, Peacemaker answered, shrugging his wings. When the two were a distance away from the history cave and were out of earshot from anyone, Peacemaker finally spoke about what she had done. You and Cliff planned that, right? He asked, point blank. Hyena looked at Peacemaker, smiled. We all planned it, actually, Hyena replied, seeing Peacemaker's eyes widen in shock as she inferred that the entire winglet had been made aware of her disruption before he did. Come now, Peacemaker. Everyone in our winglet has seen your expression whenever Webbs hands back your assignments. We were getting worried, she continued, placing a wing over his shoulder. She had a point. The last tests handed back to Peacemaker. He would try to hide his displeasure at the low grades he received, but it seemed his talons ever so slightly curling on the edge of the parchment, causing the paper to crumple ever slightly, were easily noticeable by his friends. Peacemaker's wings drooped to his side, realizing that the entire winglet had been concerned for him, and how Hyena and Cliff had risked their grades, maybe even their placements in the academy, for helping Peacemaker cheat on his test. I'm sorry, Peacemaker apologized. I did not mean to be a burden. Don't be, Hyena replied, smiling as she placed a wing over his shoulder. To be honest, those questions weren't bugging the moons out of me to begin with, so I was doing Webbs a favor. Even though the way she said those words sounded arrogant, Hyena's tone, however, showed she actually meant what she said and that there was no disrespect to Webbs, despite his annoyance at her interruption. Well, I hope Webbs doesn't get on your case too much about your, corrections, Peacemaker said sincerely. Don't worry about Webbs, Hyena grinned as she said this. He'll probably pull me to the side next class, tell me how to be professional in my commentary, but he's passionate about history, just like I am. We just have different points of view about how history should be taught. And how do you think history should be taught? Peacemaker asked, honestly not really sure how one would teach history outside of the classroom, when you also have different classes that need your attention. Hyena's smirk returned. Quite simple, actually. Its impacts on our lives today, Hyena explained. I mean, 6 years later, and we are still feeling the effects of the Sandwing War of Succession, which was caused by unforeseen what-ifs in the tribe laws. She then gestured to Peacemaker. The Nightwings themselves still are recovering from their exile, even if your generation never lived on the island. You have a point. Hyena nodded at his comment. History is more than just reading books and doing tests. Webbs isn't a bad teacher, he just needs to revise a few things. Peacemaker admitted, while he still was not sure about history being a favorite subject of his, he liked Hyena's ideas. It was nice to hear her explain the history while not putting Webbs down behind his back like some of the other students in the class would do after he graded their assignments poorly. Hyena made her case on how Webbs could improve his classes while also being respectful to him on the things he did right. Peacemaker had to admit that Hyena was an interesting individual, even if she did tend to embarrass Alligator a lot. That's when he remembered the interactions between Hyena and the Mudwing. How affectionate they seemed. Wait, you and Alligator, Peacemaker began, raising a brow at his clawmate, who looked back at him, an eyebrow raised. Are you two, like, a couple? At first, he was afraid Hyena was about to rebuff him, irritably, based on her silence from his question. But her chuckle and the way she shook her head confirmed that she was not outwardly offended. Maybe even more amused. Oh, no, Peacemaker, Hyena said, chuckling after speaking. We're a not couple. I'm sorry? What was that even supposed to mean? What was a not couple? Instead of answering his question, Hyena walked ahead of Peacemaker towards the undercaves of the academy, but she did spare him a glance and proceeded to wink at him before walking through the tunnels. That was odd, he admitted to himself. Peacemaker knew a lot of dragons, especially since attending the academy, but he admitted he'd met none as complex as Hyena. It was a wonder how someone like Alligator got along so well with her despite being a peculiar dragon. But she was still part of the court's winglet, and she had just helped him in the history cave. Despite how odd she was, Peacemaker still considered her a friend. A strange one, yes, but a friend nonetheless. Instead of eating dinner in the prey center, the court's winglet had decided to eat their meal during their study session and work on the history term project simultaneously. It was agreed upon by the winglet that each member would get to choose a place for the group to work on the project every other day during the school week. The rules to these decisions were simple. The place they chose to study had to be suitable to work in. Places like the prey center, where there was a huge bustle of dragons, would not be chosen. The order the members of the winglets chose were based on the listing of their names in the Academy's official welcome scroll. The only difference was that the order was in reverse. Glyph was the one who came up with that specific detail. For tonight, Tempest had been the one who had chosen where the group would work on the project, the Academy's underground lake. During her first time suggesting the place to study at, during her turn, most of the winglet were skeptical of whether Tempest would have her focus on the work, though Ermine and Peacemaker vouched for her. On his part, Peacemaker felt Tempest wouldn't get distracted since Ermine showed diligence in her own homework. Now, after 3 turns of picking a place for the winglet to study, Tempest had remained focused on the work in front of her, and they only dove into the lake when the winglet was finished working. Tonight, the winglet's focus was on their project, specifically detailing Queen Anaconda's years before becoming Queen of the Rainwings, which, for the most part, her dragonite years were short as her mother had passed away from a terminal illness when Anaconda was only 2 years old. The princess was forced to become a queen at a young age during a time when the Rainwings needed a strong queen. With a package that Peacemaker had received from Queen Glory, containing copies of letters and orders with Anaconda's seal, the winglet was going over the information provided. Ermine and Hyena were both equally fascinated with the scrolls they read. Anaconda had contacts in almost every tribes, even with the courts of Queen Vigilance, Queen Lagoon, and Queen Diamond. Ermine spoke as she examined the contents of the scroll she had thoroughly. How did she? Tempest asked, putting her scroll away to look over at Ermine's shoulder to see the writing. Surely someone within Vigilance's court would have read the minds of the spies sooner or later. Let alone putting up a convincing disguise, Cliff pointed out as he pulled the last meat off of a cowbone. Both Cliff and Peacemaker suddenly noticed how Jaguar changed his scales to a white color to mimic Ermine's scales, who ignored Jaguar's display. Cliff added, Yes, that is convincing, Jaguar. How long could you keep that up? Let alone full dragons who know their own species' appearance. Jaguar was about to retort, but paused and looked at Ermine, who sighed and continued telling everyone the scroll's contents. According to Anaconda's letter to her spy master, there were 2 ways the Rainwings had spied on the courts: camouflage and bribery. Ermine placed the scroll on the ground as she continued. Rainwing spies would infiltrate the tribes and camouflage themselves in order to learn the defensive positions of the enemy and sabotage them. Should the spies feel that they were a threat to the tribe, Ermine stroked her chin. Peacemaker could tell she was trying to think of how to word the next part. Bribery sounds complex. How so? Alligator asked, adjusting his glasses as he looked away from a scroll he had been reading. I mean, didn't the spies bribe them with gold, as any spy would? Ermine shook her heads. The way she words bribery is odd, though. Ermine thought again for a moment. No gold was involved, but in this letter, she says to her spy master that he should toy with their pleasures and remind them of their place. Why not just say, give them their gold? Peacemaker scratched his chin. Toy with their pleasures? What was that supposed to mean? Reaching for the scroll, Hyena read through the contents and smirked. Well, however her spies went about it, you got to admit that she knew how to have fun with her spy master, Hyena said, chuckling, causing everyone in the winglet to look at her. Ignoring everyone's gaze, Hyena casually passed the scroll to Alligator, who looked as if he wanted to shrink as small as he could get, as everyone now looked at him expectantly. It's not what you guys think, Alligator said, sighing in relief, before Peacemaker and the others could jump to conclusions again. But the name of her spy master says a lot, especially in the postscript. Who were they? Cliff asked, genuinely curious, it seemed, despite the information not being about the Skywings. Peacemaker admitted to himself that he was curious as well, if anything, thanks to the mystery that Hyena had established. Alligator cleared his throat and proceeded to read. Postscript. Beloved, now that business is finished, I want to speak to you, heart to heart. It is difficult, I know, that you are away for so long, and here at home even less. But know that I am grateful for the work you do, making the world safe for our unborn dragonets once they finally open their eyes and enter the world. Because of you, our tribe is safe. The burden is great, but once our tribe is secure, I will never ask you to leave my side again. Stay safe, Ada. I will see you soon. Aww. Hyena cooed after Alligator read the scroll, leaning in close till her head rested against his shoulder, smiling brightly, which seemed a little weird. That was so sweet. Hyena's actions, again, caused Alligator to blush as he held the letter up as Peacemaker and the others looked at the two. Peacemaker was starting to doubt that the Sandwing and Mudwing were more than a not couple, whatever that meant. But the name of who the scroll was addressed to finally made sense on why the mood was so informal. Anaconda was not writing just to her spy master. She was writing to her husband, King Adder. Peacemaker noticed Jaguar looking at Ermine, giving a confident smile. Looks like the scroll I found was right, in a manner of speaking. Adder was real. Ermine looked at Jaguar, rolling her eyes. I never said that King Adder was not real, Jaguar, Ermine said, biting back in an annoyed tone. I said your source had unreliable backing. Before an argument could start, Peacemaker intervened with a comment. Well, at least we can elaborate on Anaconda's reign some more, he pointed out, quietly sighing in relief when the tension between the two subsided. Yeah, Cliff said, nudging Peacemaker. Good call on contacting Queen Glory. What better way to have a reliable source than info from her family's archives? This made Peacemaker blush as the winglet nodded with Cliff's statement. Peacemaker shrugged, trying to make it seem like he did not do anything special. Anything to help you all out, he said. Us, Cliff corrected him. The rest of the winglet agreed with his statement. You're part of the winglet too, Peace. That's right, Tempest added, leaning forward. You know what Sunny always says, the winglets stick together, even if one of us struggles. Peacemaker knew where the Seawing was going with this, but the test and his grade in history. I didn't mean to worry some of you, Peacemaker muttered apologetically. If one of us fails, it reflects poorly on the rest of us, Ermine spoke bluntly. It is unwise to have someone fail the class, even if the rest of us succeed. Okay, Peacemaker admitted he felt a little cold from Ermine's comments. Tempest noticed this and frowned at her friend's comments. What she means is, we wouldn't be good friends if we let you fail. Not without helping you, Tempest said, though Ermine looked at her with a raised brow, but shrugged as she went back to her work. Well, I'll try to do better on my own next time, Peacemaker said. Even though he appreciated the winglet coming to help him when he was struggling in class, he did not want to make a habit of them letting him cheat. Hyena brushed her wing against his side, causing him to look at the Sandwing. I can help you study, she offered. That way, you can become confident enough in the class. Peacemaker could see that she was, personally, excited at the prospect of tutoring someone with her method of teaching history. And, if he were honest, Hyena tutoring him would be a nice change compared to sitting in class and struggling silently while the rest of the class were most likely succeeding. When he nodded at her offer, Hyena turned her smile towards Alligator. You see, Alligator, this is going to play out good, Hyena said to the Mudwing, who rolled his eyes behind his glasses. Never said it was a bad idea, just that it was risky if Webb saw past your scheme. And that's why my schemes are always successful, Alligator. Not all of them. We're still not allowed into the old Iceman excavation sites because of your reacquisition plot, Alligator exclaimed exasperatedly. And don't get me started on the first day. Tsunami is still giving you suspicious looks every time you're even near something ancient. Hyena shrugged away Alligator's concerns. Okay, so maybe not all of them, but you know what they say, greater the risk, greater the odds of success. Jaguar nodded in agreement with her. I like that philosophy. Just wish the rest of my tribe were like that, Jaguar stated, earning a wink from Hyena. See, Alligator? Someone gets it, Hyena pointed, all the while Alligator groaned upon hearing Jaguar and Hyena's mutual agreement, which would only mean more headaches for the Mudwing, everyone assumed. Needless to say, Peacemaker admired Hyena's adventurous side, especially her enthusiasm with history. If only he were more like her in regards to her passion in the stories of old, and those who lived in the past long before him. It was a good thing that Hyena volunteered to tutor him, then. She could help him find a way to become passionate about history. But for now, passing Webbs' class is all that mattered to him. That way, he could continue through school and make his mother, Moon, and everyone who had supported him this far in his life proud of him. The stories of those who lived thousands of years ago could wait a little longer for him to be excited enough to read them passionately.